23 investors had walked out of Sylvia Crane's conference room in 14 months. Some left politely. Most didn't bother finishing the coffee. She was 37 years old, the founder of a company she had built from a borrowed desk and a half-formed theory about how the world was designed for people who didn't need help. And she was watching it die one courtesy rejection at a time. The wheelchair was the thing they couldn't stop looking at, and the thing they couldn't stop not looking at. A different kind of paralysis than hers, the kind that lives in the chest, where you see a person and you see only the pieces, and you cannot assemble them back into someone worth betting on. Then a man walked in, carrying a 7-year-old on his back because her feet hurt, and she'd stopped walking somewhere around the parking garage. He had a 3-page handwritten business case tucked into his jacket pocket and a way of sitting very still that made Sylvia uneasy before he'd said a single word. He wasn't a venture capitalist. He wasn't even close. But he was the only one who came back. If that already has you, leave a heart in the comments. I'll meet you at the bottom. The conference room on the 4th floor of the Veritas Build office had a window that looked out over downtown Denver. And on a clear morning, you could see the mountains, pale blue and indifferent, pressed against the edge of the sky like a promise no one had actually made. Sylvia had chosen this office for that view. 3 years ago, when her company was 18 months old and she had 17 employees and a lease on a space she could barely afford, she had decided that people working on problems nobody wanted to solve deserved to be able to look at something beautiful while they worked. That was then. Now the view was the same. The mountains were the same. But 12 of those 17 employees were gone. The lease was renegotiated to something that felt more like survival than ambition, and Sylvia sat at the head of the conference table, watching the door close behind a man named Robert Atchison, who had flown in from San Francisco specifically to tell her, very gently, that the timing just was not right. The timing. 22 months ago it had been perfect timing. Veritas Build was 3 years in, growing fast, positioned at the intersection of two things no one could argue with: the expanding population of Americans who lived with disabilities and the creaking inaccessibility of the built environment they were expected to navigate anyway. Sylvia had the data, the model, the traction, and a pitch that had won 3 national awards for business clarity. Then the accident happened in February. By April, 3 of her early investors had quietly begun exploratory conversations with her CFO about the succession plan. By June, her CFO, a man named Conrad Weld, who had been her first hire, who had sat in this same room and told her that Veritas Build was the most important company he'd ever worked for, had organized those conversations into something that looked, from a certain angle, like a strategy. She had been in the rehabilitation center for 11 weeks. She came back to an office that smelled the same and felt like a place where someone else had been living. Conrad was still there. She'd kept him, which the lawyers had said was foolish, and which she had done anyway, partly because firing him would have required a kind of open warfare she didn't have the energy for, and partly because Conrad was, whatever else he was, genuinely good at his job. He ran the finances with the calm efficiency of someone who had accepted that the ship might sink and had decided to organize the deck chairs by height anyway. She hadn't told him about the physical therapy. She hadn't told anyone. The leather portfolio case sat on the table in front of her, the way it always did. Dark brown, worn at the corners. The brass clasp tarnished to the color of old nickels. She'd carried it everywhere since she was 24. It was the case she'd had with her the night she gave her first real pitch, in a rented room above a bar in Boulder, to 11 people, only 4 of whom had come deliberately. It contained, among other things, the original hand-drawn architectural diagrams she had made in the first year of Veritas Build, before she'd had a drafting team or a designer, when the whole theory of the company still lived mainly in her own head and she had been trying to pull it out and make it visible. She hadn't opened it since February. It was just a wait now. A familiar one. The door opened, and her office manager, a calm and efficient woman named Diane, leaned in. "There's still someone in the waiting area," she said. "He's been there since 2:15. Sylvia checked her watch. It was 3:40. "The Axon meeting ran long," she said. "I know. I told him." Diane paused. His daughter fell asleep in the chair. He put his jacket over her. Sylvia looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, "Send him in." His name was Daniel Reese. He shook her hand with the kind of grip that communicated nothing except that he had been raised by someone who had told him to be firm but not performative about it, and then he sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table and looked at her the way almost no one had looked at her in 22 months. Not at the wheelchair, not past it, at her. "I appreciate you seeing me," he said. "You waited an hour and 45 minutes. I had nowhere else to be." He said it without embarrassment. "And my daughter needed the sleep. She had school this morning and she doesn't do well with early starts." "How old? 7? And her mother?" He didn't flinch. "She died 3 years ago. Cancer?" He said it the way you say a thing you've said enough times that you've learned to keep your face level while you say it, not because it doesn't hurt, but because you've decided the hurt is yours and you're not going to put it on a stranger. Sylvia noted that. "Mr. Reese," she said, "I have to be honest with you. You're not the profile I typically see for this kind of conversation. Veritas Build's minimum investment threshold is $250,000, he said. "I know. I read your materials." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced 3 folded pages. "I wrote some things down. I know it's not standard, and I know I'm not what you're looking for, but I'd like 5 minutes to explain why I think I should be." She looked at the folded papers. Then at him. Nobody had brought handwritten notes to a pitch meeting with her since 2019. She had forgotten, she realized, what it felt like to see someone come in with a pen and paper instead of a slide deck and a recited summary. 5 minutes, she said. He unfolded the pages carefully. The way you handle something you have revised several times and know by heart but want to get right anyway. Daniel Reese was 34 years old. He had been a construction project manager for 9 years, working mostly on commercial builds in the Denver metro area, which meant he spent a substantial portion of his professional life reading architectural specifications and identifying places where the gap between what a building was supposed to do and what it actually did had become someone's expensive problem. He had, in that time, personally flagged 31 accessibility non-compliance issues across 7 major projects. He had learned enough about ADA standards to have very strong opinions about them. He had also, 3 years ago, received a small inheritance from his grandmother and had been holding it in a money market account ever since. Not because he was passive about it, but because he had been looking for something that made sense to him in a way that generic index funds and someone else's technology bets did not. He had found Veritas Build through a contractor friend who had worked with their team on an accessibility audit for a downtown hotel. The friend had said, "These people know what they are talking about," which was not a thing contractors said lightly about outside consultants. Daniel had done his research. He had read Sylvia's original business plan, which was available in excerpted form through a business school case study. He had read the press coverage from 3 years ago, and from 22 months ago, and from last month. He had looked at the public contract filings and had identified 3 patterns that he thought no one in the room was talking about. He explained them now, clearly and without hurrying. Sylvia listened. She had a habit, in pitch meetings, of keeping her face completely neutral, which she had cultivated because the alternative, letting people see that they were boring her or that she had already made up her mind, was unkind and also telegraphed too much. But the neutrality right now was genuine in a way it hadn't been in a long time, because the things Daniel Reese was saying were not what she had expected from the man who had been waiting in her lobby with a 7-year-old under his coat. He had identified the same pattern she had been fighting about with Conrad for 6 months, that Veritas Build's model worked best not as a standalone consulting firm, but as an embedded partner in large-scale commercial projects from the planning stage. The market was not treating it that way. Most of the firm's revenue was still remediation work, fixing buildings after the fact, after the concrete was poured and the corridors were too narrow and the elevator was in the wrong place. Bringing in Veritas Build after the fact was like calling the structural engineer after the walls were up. You could do it. It just cost 3 times as much and fixed half as much. Daniel had looked at this gap and had done rough calculations on what it would mean in revenue terms if even 12% of the remediation clients converted to partnership contracts, brought in at the design phase rather than the inspection phase. The number was not small. "Where did you get the revenue figures to build that model?" Sylvia asked. "Public filings," he said. industry benchmarks from the Accessibility Compliance Association. I had to estimate some of it. Your estimate was close. I thought it might be. She looked at him. Mr. Reese, $250,000 is not, on its own, the kind of capital infusion Veritas Build needs right now. I'm not going to mislead you about that. I know. He met her eyes. I'm not offering to save you. I'm offering to be the first one in when everyone else is standing outside. Because I think that means something. I think the next person who comes through that door is going to look at whether anybody else has bet on this. And right now the answer is no. And I think that is a bigger problem than the number. The room was quiet. Outside, through the glass, Denver went about its business. A delivery truck pulling away from a loading bay. A cyclist navigating the corner below. The ordinary traffic of a city that did not know or care that a woman was sitting in this room trying to decide if this man understood something real or was just very good at sounding like he did. The investment wouldn't make you a board member, she said. The structure I'm offering is equity only, minority position, no governance rights. I want that to be clear before you sign anything. I read the terms. I'm not asking for a board seat. He folded the pages back together with the same careful precision he'd used to open them. I just want to be in the room. Sylvia looked at the leather portfolio sitting on the table between them, at the worn brass clasp. Then at Daniel Reese, who was watching her with the kind of patient stillness that she had learned, in the last 22 months, was not actually a neutral state. Patience was always a choice. It was something a person decided, again and again, in the space where the impatience wanted to be. I'll have our legal team send you the documentation, she said. He nodded once, said thank you in a way that meant it, stood, shook her hand again with that same unremarkable grip, and went to collect his daughter from the waiting area. Sylvia sat alone in the conference room for 4 minutes after he left. Through the window she could see, distantly, the mountains holding their position at the horizon. Pale blue. Still, not promising anything. She pulled the leather portfolio toward her, rested one hand on the tarnished clasp, did not open it, put it back in her bag. She had gotten very good at that particular motion. Conrad came to her office the morning after Daniel signed, with a cup of coffee she had not asked for and a careful expression she had learned to read over 5 years. He set the coffee on her desk with the deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed the gesture. I looked him up, Conrad said. I expected you would. Daniel Reese, project manager. Mid-level commercial construction, 9 years. No board experience, no capital markets background, no prior investments of record. He sat down in the chair she had not offered. This is $250,000 from an inheritance. It's not a signal to the market. It's a personal bet. Yes, she said. It's not going to be enough. Individually, nothing ever is, she said. You know that. He looked at her. He had a particular quality of worry, not for himself, she had always believed, but for the thing they had built together. Conrad Weld had poured 6 years into the financial architecture of Veritas Build, had built systems and processes that were elegant in their efficiency, had stayed through the interruption of the accident, and managed the bleed with a precision that had probably saved the company from a faster collapse. She did not doubt this. She also did not doubt that the worry, however genuine, had somewhere along the way become inseparable from the question of whether she personally should still be the one running it. The investor coalition is not your enemy, he said. I know what it is, Conrad. They're scared. The market is moved. The company needs to demonstrate the model works, she said, which requires time, which requires not having an emergency governance review every time someone gets scared. She looked at him. I need you to trust me. Or, I need you to tell me honestly that you don't. He was quiet. In the silence, she could hear the office outside, Diane's keyboard, the low sound of someone on a phone call in the open workspace, the elevator arriving on their floor, the ordinary texture of people doing work. I trust your judgment, Conrad said finally. I'm not sure I trust the circumstances. The circumstances are what they are, she said. My judgment is the same one it's always been. Those two things are not the same concern. And I need you to separate them. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee, his own coffee, not hers, and stood. He walked to the door. He stopped. What happens if the Reese investment doesn't lead anywhere? He said. If it doesn't signal anything? If the next investor doesn't come? What's the plan? The same plan it's always been, she said. We build something good enough that people have to notice eventually. He left. She sat with his question for a while, because the honest answer to it, not the one she'd given him, but the one that lived underneath, was that she did not entirely know. She knew the plan. She knew the next 3 steps. But the thing about holding the line in a slow war is that you stop being able to see very far ahead. You can only see the next few inches of ground, and you hold them, and then the next. And you try not to calculate too precisely how far there is still to go. Daniel Reese had said, I just want to be in the room. She had not fully understood when he said it what he meant. In the room was not a board seat. It was not governance rights or decision authority or the ability to call emergency reviews. Being in the room meant showing up. It meant occupying a space in the physical and operational reality of the company in a way that said, I'm here, I'm watching, I believe this is worth watching. It was a small thing. It had been a very long time since anyone had offered her a small thing and meant it. It took Conrad Weld approximately 48 hours to find out about Daniel Reese. He appeared in her doorway on a Thursday morning with a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for and an expression that he had clearly been arranging on his face since somewhere around the elevator. I saw the paperwork from legal, he said. Then you have the information you need. Sylvia, he came in, which she hadn't invited him to do, and sat down in the chair across from her desk. 250. That doesn't move anything. It moves something. It moves the optics, not the fundamentals. The investor coalition has 3 more firms lined up. They've asked for an emergency board review by the end of the quarter. She looked at him. Conrad Weld was 51, careful, and the kind of man whose loyalty had always been to the thing he was building rather than to the person who had asked him to help build it. She had understood this about him from the beginning, and had hired him anyway because it was a kind of honesty, in its way. He loved the company. He had just decided, somewhere in the months she'd been away, that the company's best chance of survival was a version that did not include her. She had not yet decided what to do about that. Tell the coalition, she said, that the company's founder is still its CEO, that the operations are being managed, and that any board review will happen through the proper channels on the proper schedule. They're not going to wait. Then they'll be waiting anyway. And the waiting will be theirs to explain. She turned back to her monitor. Close the door on your way out, Conrad. He left the coffee. He did not close the door. She closed it herself, the long way around the desk, and then sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and looked at the mountains through the window and thought about what it cost, every day, to hold the line when there was no cavalry coming. The answer was the same every time she asked it. It cost everything you had left. And then you found out you had a little more left than you thought. And then you spent that too. The documentation from legal arrived in Daniel Reese's email at 4:17 on Friday afternoon. He called her office at 9:14 Monday morning to say that he'd reviewed it, that he had one question about the vesting schedule, and that assuming the answer was what he thought it was going to be, he'd be ready to sign by the end of the week. The answer was what he thought it was going to be. He signed on Thursday. It was not a trumpet blast. There was no press release. Sylvia had thought about a press release and had decided it would be worse than nothing. The amount was too modest to impress the people she needed to impress, and announcing it would invite comparisons she wasn't ready to invite. So instead there was a wire transfer confirmation from a bank she had never heard of and a single PDF of signed documents that her assistant put in a folder on the shared drive. And that was it. Conrad said nothing. Which was, she had found, more unsettling than if he had said something. Daniel Reese showed up in the Veritas Build office for the first time as a minority equity holder on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after the signing, carrying a paper bag from a sandwich place 2 blocks down and a specific question about a section of the partnership contract proposal she was working on. He knocked. He waited to be told to come in. She noted that too. I've been thinking about the embedded partner model, he said, setting the bag on the edge of her desk without asking whether she wanted it. The one you've been pushing. The design phase integration rather than the remediation cleanup. I know what my model is. Right, he sat down. He had, she was beginning to notice, a particular quality of taking up exactly the space he was in without trying to expand into more of it or contract into less. I've been talking to some of my contacts in the commercial construction world. Preliminary conversations, nothing formal. I want to be transparent about that. I'm not going out and pitching Veritas Build on your behalf without clearing it first. She looked at him. Why are you clearing it? Because it's your company and your relationships, and I just bought a minority equity stake. Clearing it seems like the right move. Most investors at your level don't think that way. I'm not most investors, he said, at my level or otherwise. He said it without irony, just as a statement of fact. There was a pause. Sylvia opened the sandwich bag, found that he had correctly guessed she would want the turkey on whole grain rather than the Italian, and said nothing about it because saying something would require acknowledging that he had thought about her preference, which was the kind of observation she wasn't quite ready to examine. Tell me what you said to your contacts, she said. He told her. He had spoken to 3 project managers he trusted, at 3 different commercial development firms, all of whom had projects in the planning stage. He had asked, carefully, whether any of them had considered bringing in an accessibility consultant at the design phase rather than the inspection phase. 2 of them had said they hadn't thought about it. One of them had said he'd thought about it a lot but hadn't known who to call. That last one, Sylvia said. I thought you'd say that. His name was a man named Gil Barros, who was managing the planning phase of a mixed-use development on the east side of Denver. Office space, residential units, ground floor retail. It was the kind of project that, if designed with accessibility integration from the ground up, would be a case study. And if it wasn't, it would be another expensive remediation call in 4 years. I can set up a call, Daniel said. I'll take that meeting. I know you will. He stood up. I'll reach out to Gil this afternoon. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. One other thing. What? The documents from your last 2 investor meetings. The ones that went poorly. Do you have transcripts or notes? She looked at him. Why? Because I want to understand what didn't land. I have a hypothesis about it, but I'd rather check the data first. The leather portfolio was on the edge of her desk, the way it always was. He glanced at it once, not a searching look, just the automatic inventory glance of someone who notices their surroundings. And then his eyes came back to her. I'll pull the notes from the files, she said. Thank you. He nodded and walked out, and she listened to his footsteps go down the hall, and she thought, without being able to stop herself, that this was the strangest 40 minutes of her professional life in at least 2 years, which was a low bar, admittedly, but it was a bar. The call with Gil Barros happened the following week. Sylvia ran it, Daniel sat in the corner of her office and took notes on a legal pad, and Barros was direct in a way she had found rare. He told her what he needed, what he was worried about, and what his timeline looked like, and then he listened to her talk about what Veritas Build actually did, which was not what most people thought it did when they heard accessibility consultant. Sylvia's firm did not come in and point at things that weren't code compliant. It embedded with design and engineering teams from concept through construction to create spaces that worked for the full range of human bodies from the first day of occupancy. It was, she said, the difference between building a house that could be retrofitted for a wheelchair and building a house where a wheelchair was never a problem in the first place. Barros was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, why isn't everyone doing it this way? Because the short-term cost of integration looks bigger than the long-term cost of remediation, she said. It isn't, but it looks that way. That's a sales problem. That's part of it. Yes, I might have another project, he said. Can we talk again next month? She said yes. When she got off the call, she turned to find Daniel already at the whiteboard she kept on the side wall of her office, writing down the follow-up items in his clear, slightly architectural block lettering. You don't have to do that, she said. I know. He finished the list. But I'm here, and this is what I'm thinking about, and it seemed efficient. She looked at the whiteboard, at his handwriting, which was the kind that made you trust that the numbers attached to it were right, then at the window, then at her desk. The leather portfolio. She reached out and moved it 3 inches to the left. a purely reflexive motion, making room for her notepad. Daniel did not look at the portfolio. He was still looking at the whiteboard, adding a detail he'd apparently forgotten. She told herself this was not a thing that needed noticing. 2 weeks after the Barrows call, Daniel brought a proposition that was either very good or very foolish, and she spent 3 days deciding which. He wanted to hire her lead architect, a meticulous and underpaid woman named Priya Nair, for an additional 10 hours a week to begin preliminary accessibility specs for the Barrows project, which they did not yet have a contract for, on the theory that having the spec work done in advance would accelerate the pitch when the contract came, and would also demonstrate to Barrows that Veritas Build operated at a different speed than the remediation consultants he was used to. "You're proposing we do the work before we get paid for it," Sylvia said. "I'm proposing we demonstrate the value before we invoice for it. There's a difference. That difference is what people say when they're not the ones fronting the cost." "Fair point." He looked at her steadily. "I'll fund the 10 extra hours. Priya's rate, whatever she charges, for 10 weeks. That's my cost, not yours." Sylvia looked at him. "That's not how minority equity positions work," she said. "I know. I'm not doing it as an investor. I'm doing it because I believe in the project, and I can afford to do it, and it seems like the right move." He picked up his coffee. "You can tell me it's out of line." "It's out of line." Okay, he didn't move. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for 36 hours, and then told Priya she'd approved the additional hours, paid for by a supplemental budget she did not explain in detail. Priya asked no questions, which was why Sylvia valued her. She simply said thank you and started working on the specs the following morning. Daniel was in the office twice that week, once to drop off some contractor cost data he'd pulled from previous projects that Priya might find useful, once to meet with Diane about the logistics of a site visit he was setting up for the following month. Both times he knocked. Both times he waited. Both times, when he was leaving, he walked past her office, stopped, and looked through the doorway. Not in, exactly, just at the doorway. She wasn't sure what he was doing. She found that she watched for it anyway. It was on the second visit that she noticed it for the first time. She had dropped her pen, a small thing, a reflex, and had reached down to get it. And when she straightened up, her left hand was resting on the arm of the wheelchair, and she felt, before she thought about it, a faint and precise pressure. Not pain. Not quite sensation. Not in the way she'd had sensation there before the accident. Something smaller and stranger. Like a word in a language she'd once known well, but had been so long without hearing that she couldn't be certain she hadn't imagined it. She set the pen down on the desk, sat very still. It had been there, and then it was gone. She did not write it down. She did not call her physical therapist, a serious woman named Doctor, Wen, who had been clear with her from the beginning about the importance of not projecting meaning onto random neurological noise. She did not tell anyone. She filed it in the same part of her mind where she filed all the things that might mean something and might mean nothing. Quietly, without ceremony, with the door left slightly open. And she went back to work. The Gil Barrows contract came through 6 weeks later. It was smaller than the full engagement would eventually become, but it was a real contract with a real scope, signed and dated and accompanied by a deposit that Sylvia's accounting system had not seen the like of in 7 months. She did not let herself feel too much about it, but she did carry the leather portfolio into the conference room the morning the contract arrived, and she set it on the table in front of her, and she sat with it for a moment before the day started, her hand resting on the warm, worn leather, and thought about the person who had packed this case 3 years ago with hand-drawn diagrams and a theory about how the world could be different. She closed her eyes. She didn't open the clasp. But she kept her hand there for a long moment, which was further than she'd gotten in almost 2 years. Then Diane knocked to say Daniel was in the lobby, and Sylvia moved the portfolio to the side of the table, and she went to work. The thing about Daniel Reese that Sylvia could not quite categorize was that he did not behave the way the others had behaved. The 23 who had left, not all of them had been cold about it. Some had been warm, some had been encouraging. 2 of them had sent handwritten notes afterward saying they hoped things worked out, which was an extraordinary thing to do to someone you had just declined to believe in. But all of them, warm or cold, had approached her company the same way, from a distance. As a document. As a set of numbers that told a story they were trying to find the least complicated way to interpret. Daniel read the documents too. He asked about the numbers. But he also spent time in the actual office, talking to Priya Nair about the specs for the Barrows project, to the 3 remaining analysts about the tools they were using, to Diane about how the scheduling worked. He did not insert himself into any of this. He asked questions, and he listened to the answers, and he came back the following week and asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he'd actually retained what he'd been told. It was, Sylvia thought, the most basic form of paying attention. She could not explain why it felt, after 2 years, almost unprecedented. Conrad came into her office in the 3rd week of October with a manila folder containing what he described as a summary of investor sentiment, which was his way of saying he had been collecting signatures. 11 of the original 14 investors had now formally indicated support for a governance review. He set the folder on her desk with the careful placement of someone delivering a verdict and wanting to make sure the weight of it was felt. "This isn't a hostile action," he said. "This is shareholders trying to protect their investment." A governance review initiated without cause and timed to the exact quarter when we have a new contract in hand, she said. "Tell me what part of that reads as protective rather than opportunistic." The Barrows contract is preliminary. The Barrows contract is signed. It's a planning phase engagement, not a full-build partnership. The revenue won't hit until, Conrad, she looked at him. "What do you want?" "Not the coalition. You. What outcome are you working toward?" He was quiet for a moment. He had the look, she thought, of someone who has rehearsed the thing they are about to say but is now reconsidering whether they want to say the rehearsed version or something more honest. "I want the company to survive," he said finally. "So do I. I'm not sure the path you're on gets us there. And your path does." He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. His path was the path where Veritas Build continued without Sylvia Crane running it, and it was probably, in the narrow financial sense, not the stupidest idea anyone had ever had. He was not a bad man. He loved this company in his particular bloodless way. He had spent 3 years building its financial infrastructure, and he watched it struggling now with the genuine pain of someone who had built something real and did not want to watch it come apart. He was just wrong about what it needed. She had to keep reminding herself of that. Not wrong about his love for the thing, wrong about where the thing's soul lived. "The board review will go through proper channels," she said. "I'll respond to it through proper channels. That's all I have to say." He picked up the folder. He left. She sat with the silence for a moment. The particular quality of silence that an office makes when the person who just left it is not done with you yet, and then she called her attorney. A precise and absolutely tireless woman named Rachel, who had been managing the Veritas Build corporate structure since the beginning, and had a quality of voice on the phone that made everything sound like it was going to be fine regardless of whether it was actually going to be fine. Sylvia told her about the folder. Rachel told her what to do. Sylvia wrote it down and then told herself she would go through proper channels and hold the line and not panic. Then she went to the window and looked at the mountains and permitted herself 3 minutes of something that was adjacent to despair but was not quite despair itself, which was the closest she was willing to come. 3 minutes exactly. She had learned to time it. Then she went back to work. Daniel appeared later that afternoon, which she had not expected, and stopped in her doorway with a look that said he'd picked up on something in the office's air without being told what it was. "Bad day?" he said. Complicated day. He came in without being invited, which was the first time he'd done that, and sat down in the chair. He did not ask what had happened. He looked at the legal notepad on her desk, which had Rachel's name at the top and a list of action items in Sylvia's compact handwriting, and he said, "Governance review?" She looked at him. "Conrad doesn't exactly have a poker face," he said, and he passed me in the hall with a manila folder and the expression of a man who has just done something he can't entirely convince himself was right. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. 11 investors, she said. "Asking for a formal review?" He nodded once, not reacting much, just taking it in. "What's your plan?" he said. "Counter it through proper channels. Respond formally. Demonstrate that the operations are sound and the board review has no legal basis for emergency status. That takes time. Yes, he looked at the window, at the mountains, then back at her. What would it take to get one more signed contract in the next 30 days? She looked at him. The Barros engagement is, I know about Barros. I'm talking about something else. A second firm, different industry, preferably one with a public-facing accessibility component that would look good in an operations report. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Because a company with 2 active contracts in 30 days doesn't look like a company in distress. It looks like a company that's turning a corner. Sylvia thought about this. The hospitality sector, she said slowly. Hotels. ADA compliance is a recurring litigation exposure for mid-sized chains, and most of them are handling it reactively rather than proactively. I have a contact at a regional chain that's been talking about a comprehensive accessibility audit for 2 years. Can you get a meeting? I can call tomorrow morning. Then call tomorrow morning. He stood up, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. I have a guy who handles ADA litigation defense for commercial properties. I'll have him send me a summary of recent exposure cases in the region. If your contact needs a reason to move on this now, rather than in another 2 years, a real number on litigation exposure usually does it. She looked at him for a long moment. You're treating this like a construction project, she said. He paused. Is that wrong? No, she said. It's actually not. She thought about it. In construction, when the building is at risk, you don't argue about whether it should be at risk. You shore up the foundation. Right. That's what you're doing. That's what I'm doing, he agreed. He left. She sat in the quiet office and thought about the particular quality of being helped by someone who didn't make you feel like you were being helped, who just showed up and did the next useful thing, cleanly, without needing acknowledgement or credit or the satisfaction of your gratitude. Her fiancé had not been that kind of person. Most people, she had found, were not that kind of person. They helped loudly or they didn't help, and she had learned to work around both. This was different. She was still working out what to do with it. The days had a shape now that they hadn't had before, which was a thing she noticed without dwelling on it too much, because dwelling on things too much was how you scared them away. Tuesdays and Thursdays she went to physical therapy and came directly to the office, which meant she arrived earlier than usual and the building was quiet, and the light through the mountain window was the kind of early light that belongs to nobody yet. Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays Daniel was usually in some part of the building, working on some aspect of what had begun to feel less like a charitable investment and more like a joint project without a formal name for what it was. She watched him learn the company, not in the way an investor learns a company, from the outside, through the numbers, but in the way a project manager learns a site. He walked around it. He talked to the people in it. He found out where the friction was and what was causing it and what it would take to address it, and then he would appear in her doorway and say something like, Priya says the document management system is creating a bottleneck on the audit side. Is that something you've already earmarked? And she would either say yes, it's handled, or tell him why it wasn't, and he would nod and file it and not bring it up again. He had, she noticed, exactly no interest in being right in a way that required her to be wrong. He had the information. He shared it. He moved on. This was rarer than it should have been. She told Diane one afternoon that she thought the investment process had been handled well. Diane looked at her with the expression of someone who works very closely with a person and has opinions she mostly keeps to herself. He's very steady, Diane said, which was the most diplomatic version of a larger observation, and Sylvia let it stand. She called the hotel chain the next morning. The meeting happened the following week. The contract, a phased accessibility audit covering 6 properties across Colorado and Wyoming, was in preliminary negotiation by the end of the month, a second signed engagement sitting alongside the Barros project in the folder Rachel kept for quarterly reports. It was not enough to stop Conrad's coalition. It was enough to make the emergency board review look premature. The review was scheduled. The date was set. 31 days. Sylvia noted this the way she noted most things, without letting herself feel it fully yet, filing it in the place where she kept the things she would deal with when she got to them, and going back to work. The physical therapy sessions happened on Tuesday and Thursday mornings before the office opened. She drove herself, which she was fully capable of doing, in the adapted vehicle she'd had since the first month of rehab, and she was usually the second or third patient in the door. Her therapist, Dr. Wen, was not given to excess encouragement, which suited Sylvia exactly. Dr. Wen told her what the data said and what the next phase of work was and what timeline was realistic. And she did not say things like amazing or you're doing so well, and Sylvia appreciated this the way she appreciated a precisely written contract, because it was honest, and didn't ask her to perform a gratitude she didn't quite feel yet. In the 6th week of October, Dr. Wen noted during assessment that there was a measurable increase in response in the left leg. She said it clinically, the way she said all things. She marked it in the chart. She said they would begin a new set of exercises targeting that response. Sylvia drove to work afterward and sat in the parking garage for approximately 4 minutes before going inside. She did not tell anyone. She had a theory, which was this, that the moment she told someone, it would become a thing that could be lost again. It would become a hope that had a name, and named hopes had a way of becoming attached to timelines and expectations and other people's feelings, and then when the timeline slipped or the expectation didn't land, you had not just a medical setback, but a social one on top of it. She had already lived through the original injury being a social event, the calls, the sympathy, the slow pulling away as the sympathy dried up. She was not going to make the recovery, if it was a recovery, into the same thing. So she kept it to herself and went into the office and worked, and on some mornings when Daniel was in the building she found herself wondering, in the distant and almost academic way she permitted herself, what it would be like to tell him. Not the whole thing, just something might be changing. And to have him receive it the way he received everything, without flinching, without making it bigger than it was or smaller than it was. She did not tell him. But she thought about it. And that, she recognized, was its own kind of data. The article appeared on a Tuesday. Sylvia saw it first on her phone at 6:40 in the morning, before she had made coffee or opened her laptop or done any of the small preparatory things that made the beginning of a day feel manageable. The Denver Business Journal ran a business and leadership section that she had followed for years, first because it covered her own company, and later, in the darker months, because knowing what the local business world was saying about you was better than not knowing. The headline was 3 words. 3 careful, irrefutable-looking words. Veritas Build. Leadership Concerns. She read the article twice. It was not long. It was written in the even, we are simply reporting what sources tell us tone that publications use when they want to convey speculation as fact, without being technically liable for it. The sources were not named. The article noted that multiple investors with ties to the company had raised concerns about the CEO's capacity to manage the firm following a significant medical event in the previous year. The word used was not cognitive impairment, exactly. The word used was focus. Whether Miss Crane's focus is fully recovered was a question her investors are, according to sources, actively exploring. Focus, she put the phone down. She picked it up again. She put it down. She had been running this company for 5.5 years. She had taken it from a theory scrawled on the back of a restaurant receipt to a firm with active contracts, a client roster, and a methodology that 3 universities had requested to study. Her IQ had not changed in the accident. Her capacity to think had not changed. The only things that had changed were the ones that had changed, and none of them were the ones the article was implying. Rachel called at 7:15. She had already read it. She sounded exactly as she always sounded, calm and absolute, like a woman who had been through several versions of this kind of thing before, and had learned that the best response to a controlled explosion was controlled containment. We issue a statement, Rachel said. Today, before the afternoon news cycle picks it up. 1 paragraph, factual, no defensiveness. Who gave them that? We don't know yet. Conrad, we don't know, Rachel. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. Who else? Rachel paused. Write down what you want the statement to say and send it to me by 9. I'll clean it up and we'll release through the official channels. The board review. This doesn't change the board review. It makes it uglier, but it doesn't change it. Keep working. Statement by 9. Sylvia wrote the statement. She sent it to Rachel. She did not call Conrad, which was the hardest thing she had done in several months, because the thing she wanted most was to call Conrad and say what she felt, which would not be useful. Instead, she sat in her office with the door closed and looked at the mountains and thought about the word focus. The mountains were not particularly sympathetic. The statement went out at 10:15. She did not look at the comments section. Daniel texted at 11. He said, "I saw the article. Are you in the office?" She replied, "Yes." He said, "I'll be there at 2. He arrived at 5 minutes before 2, which she had learned was his version of punctual. He was never late, but he didn't want to be the person standing at the door when you unlocked it either. He came in and sat down and looked at her and said, "Tell me what you need." She looked at him. "I don't need. Not to rescue you," he said. "I know. Tell me what you need." She thought about it. "The investor meeting is in 18 days. I need to walk in there with the operations record that makes the article irrelevant, not rebutted. Irrelevant, what would that take?" 2 things. She turned her notepad toward him. "The Barrows project needs to be far enough along that I can present actual deliverables, not projections. And I need an independent audit of the last 18 months of operations, financial, operational, strategic, conducted by someone with no relationship to Conrad or the coalition, that I can present as third-party verification." Daniel looked at the notepad. "The Barrows deliverables I think Priya can accelerate if she has another set of hands. Let me make a call." "And the audit?" He was quiet for a moment. "I know someone," he said. "She's a business operations consultant who does exactly this kind of work. She's not cheap. Can she be ready in, I'll ask today?" He called from the conference room. She could hear the low register of his voice through the wall, not the words, just the cadence, patient, specific, direct. He came back 12 minutes later. "She can start Monday," he said. "She wants 3 weeks. The fee is," he named a number. "That's too much. I'll split it with you." She looked at him. "This is still not how minority equity positions work," she said. "No," he put the number back in his pocket. "But it's how I work." She did not argue. Not because she couldn't, but because 18 days was not a lot of time, and arguing about whether Daniel Reese was being appropriate with his money was a problem that could wait until she still had a company to argue about it in. The consultant's name was Renata Forbes. She was thorough and unsmiling and had the quality of presence that made an office feel slightly more organized just by her being in it. She began on Monday. By Wednesday, she had gone through 14 months of operating records and had identified 2 additional revenue inefficiencies that Conrad had been addressing in the slowest possible way. Sylvia did not say anything to Conrad about this. She noted it in the file she was building. The city contract collapsed on Thursday. The Denver Office of Accessibility Infrastructure had been in preliminary conversations with Veritas Build for 6 weeks about a large-scale audit of public buildings, recreation centers, libraries, transit facilities. The scope was larger than anything Veritas Build had previously handled. It was exactly the kind of contract that would change the shape of the firm's growth for the next 2 years. Sylvia had been careful about it, careful not to count on it, but she had let herself look at it the way you look at something you want very much and are trying not to want too much. The project coordinator called on Thursday afternoon to say gently, and with apparent genuine regret, that in light of recent concerns in the press about Veritas Build's leadership, the city felt it needed to put the engagement on hold pending further review. Pending further review. She knew what that meant. It meant no. She thanked the coordinator. She hung up. She sat in her office with the door closed for 12 minutes. The setback had costs that weren't immediately visible. The city contract was the visible one, the revenue gap, the entry in the loss column, the item that would have to be explained in the Q4 report. But the invisible cost was more complicated. Sylvia had been building something in herself over the previous 6 weeks, a theory, still tentative, about the trajectory of the company and her role in it. A theory about what the next year could look like. The city contract had been load-bearing in that theory. Losing it meant rebuilding not just the revenue projection, but the shape of what she'd been allowing herself to imagine. She did not talk about this with Conrad, or with Rachel, or with any of the people who were managing the operational response. She talked about it, very late on the Thursday when the contract died, with no one. She drove home in the dark and made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with the leather portfolio in front of her and thought about what it cost to keep building a theory of the future when the present kept taking pieces of it. She thought about her physical therapist's language. Setback was a word Dr. Wen used carefully, because setback implied a loss of ground that might not be recoverable. The word she used instead was plateau. A plateau was a place you were, not a direction. It didn't mean down. It meant not yet. The city contract was a plateau. She could work with a plateau. Conrad came to see her the next morning. He did not bring coffee. He came in without the folder, which meant he had not come with documentation or strategy. He had come with himself, which was unusual enough that she let him sit without asking what he wanted. He sat there for a moment. Then he said, "My daughter is going to college next year. My wife is thinking about going back to work. I have a pension obligation to this company that represents, not all of it, but a significant portion of what we were planning to live on." She looked at him. "I'm not saying this to make you sympathize with me," he said. "I'm saying it so you understand that when I say I'm scared, I'm not being strategic. I'm actually scared." There was a pause. "Conrad," she said, "that is the first completely honest thing you have said to me in 6 months." He looked at the table. "I know the model is right," he said. "The partnership model. The design phase integration. I've read the case studies. I've seen the numbers. I know it's the right direction." He looked up. "I just don't know if we have enough time. Do you trust me to find out?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "I think I do." He did not, after that, stop being afraid. Fear, like most things that are real, does not resolve on the basis of a single honest conversation. But he stopped being afraid against her and started being afraid alongside her, which was a different thing entirely, and made the next 2 weeks navigable in a way they might not otherwise have been. Then she called Daniel. She had not planned to call Daniel. She had planned to call Rachel, who was the correct person to call, who would tell her the correct thing to do and the correct way to do it. Instead, she found herself dialing a number she had only begun to know by heart in the last few weeks, and she heard it ring twice, and then his voice, and she said, "The city contract is gone." He was quiet for a moment. "Where are you?" he said. "The office. I'll be there in 40 minutes. He was there in 35. He did not bring food this time, did not bring anything, just came in and sat down and let the silence be what it was for a moment before saying, "How bad is it?" "It's bad," she said. "Not fatal. But the board review in 15 days is going to be harder without that contract in the portfolio." "What does Renata have so far?" "Enough, but a report from an independent consultant countering an article implying cognitive impairment reads exactly like what it is. A defensive move. I need something that isn't defensive. I need something that goes on offense." "The LOIs," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "Letters of intent. From firms I haven't called yet." He leaned forward. "I've been holding back on reaching out to my network because I didn't want to overstep. But if the situation is 15 days, then holding back isn't being respectful, it's just being useless." He looked at her directly. "Give me permission to make calls." "To who?" 3 project managers I know from different sectors. I can't promise LOIs, but I can promise serious conversations. And serious conversations, formalized into letters of intent for future engagement, show the board something an operations report can't. They show that the market believes in this company's future, not just its past. Sylvia looked at the window. At the mountains in the gray November afternoon light, patient and indifferent as always. "Make the calls," she said. He made the calls that evening. He texted her at 10:15 that night to say he had 3 meetings scheduled for the following week, which was 3 days before the board review. She read the text sitting on the couch in her apartment with the leather portfolio on the cushion beside her. She had taken it out of her bag, just put it there, next to her. The way you keep a thing close that you haven't yet decided what to do with. She looked at it for a long time. Then she wrote back, "Thank you." And then, after a moment, "Can I ask you something?" He replied immediately, "Yes." She typed, "Why are you still here?" There was a pause. Not a long one. Then, "Because I'm not done yet." She looked at the message, put the phone down, picked it up. She typed, "The article was Conrad. I can't prove it, but it was Conrad." He replied, "I know." She looked at this. Then she typed, "You knew before today." He said, "I had a theory. I didn't want to say it until you were ready to hear it." She put the phone down and sat with that for a while. The next evening, she told him about the accident. It was not planned. They were in the conference room after hours, going through Renata's draft report, the city quiet outside the window and the office mostly dark around them. Just the lamp on the conference table and the glow of their laptops and the particular quality of late evening that makes honesty easier than it would be otherwise, because the day is over and there's less to protect. She had been trying to explain why the article about her focus had cost the city contract, and in trying to explain it, she had backed into explaining what the accident had taken, and in explaining what the accident had taken, she had found herself saying more than she'd planned. She told him about the car. About the night. February. Clear. Cold. The kind of Denver winter night where the sky was brilliant and the roads were dry and there was no reason to expect anything to go wrong. She had been in the passenger seat. Graham had been driving. He'd had 3 drinks at dinner, which was not, in her mind at the time, a serious number. He was confident. He always drove that way. She told it flat. The way you tell a thing you have told yourself enough times that the emotion has been removed from the telling without being removed from the actual memory. The impact. The sound. The way she had known, before she could have known anything, that something was different. She said, Graham walked away from the crash. He had a bruised shoulder. He called 911 from his phone at the side of the road, and then, when the ambulance came and the EMTs were with her and everything was noise and light and her spine was doing things she couldn't interpret yet, he had gotten into his car and driven home. She said, he came to the hospital twice, in the first week. The second time he told her that he needed some space. He was dealing with a lot. He was struggling with what had happened. She said she never saw him again after that. She was not looking at Daniel when she said this. She was looking at the surface of the conference table, at the grain of the wood, at the way the lamp made shadows in it. She said, the company nearly didn't survive, because the CEO was in the hospital and the early investors were nervous and the CFO was being careful, which was his right. But the part of it that she had never told anyone was that the not being able to walk had been the second hardest thing, not the first. The first hardest thing was that she had spent 11 weeks in a rehabilitation center, and the person who had put her there had not stayed long enough to watch her learn to get around it. She stopped talking. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, without drama, without visible anger, just as a statement of what he thought, he was a coward. Yes, she said, I'm sorry that happened. You don't have to. I'm not saying it because I have to. I'm saying it because it's true, and I wanted you to hear someone say it plainly. He paused. I don't think it has anything to do with your focus. She looked at him. I know that. I know you know that. I just wanted to say it out loud so it was in the room. He was quiet for a moment. Clara, my wife, she was sick for 14 months, between the diagnosis and the end. I spent those 14 months trying to be what she needed, trying to manage everything else, trying not to let Nora see how scared I was. He looked at his hands. And after I kept going to work, because that was the thing I knew how to do. People would say, you seem like you're holding up well. And I didn't know how to explain that what they were seeing was just motion, not recovery. That moving and healing weren't the same thing. She looked at him. How long before they were? He thought about it. I'm still working on it, he said, but I think the direction changed. Somewhere in the last few months. He said it without looking at her. She did not ask him to be more specific, but she thought about it. She thought about direction, about the difference between moving through a thing and moving past it and moving with it. Outside, Denver was dark and ordinary. The mountains were invisible now, just implied by the place where the light stopped. She reached out and picked up the leather portfolio from where she'd set it on the corner of the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it back down. "The board review," she said. 15 days, he said. "We should go through the rest of Renata's draft." "We should," he agreed. They stayed for another 2 hours. She thought, driving home that night, that she had told exactly one person the full version of the accident story. And that person had listened to the whole thing and had not said "I'm so sorry" more than once, and had not looked at her the way people looked at her when they were adjusting what they thought of her to account for the damage, and had simply sat with it and then said something that was true. She thought about what that cost a person to do. She thought it probably cost less for some people than it did for others. For Daniel Reese, she was beginning to understand, it cost almost nothing at all. Not because he was careless, but because it was just how he was built. She was not entirely sure what to do with someone like that. She was, for the first time in a long time, not entirely sure she wanted to figure it out alone. The morning before the board review, Sylvia arrived at the office at 7:15 to find Daniel already there with his daughter. He'd explained it the night before. Briefly, his regular Tuesday sitter had an emergency. The backup sitter was unavailable. The board review wasn't until 4 in the afternoon, and he needed to be in the office in the morning to go through the final briefing documents with Renata. He'd asked if it was all right to bring Nora, which was, in Sylvia's experience, the kind of question most people didn't think to ask. They assumed, or they didn't think, or they arrived with the child in the context together. Daniel had asked. She had said yes without thinking much about it, in the way that you say yes to a thing when you've been too tired to calculate the cost of it. Nora was 7 years old and had her father's quality of stillness without his quiet. She was not a loud child exactly, but she was a very present one, occupying the space she was in fully and without apology. She was sitting at the end of the conference table with a box of colored pencils and a stack of blank paper, drawing something that appeared to be a horse, or possibly a building. The distinction not entirely clear from the doorway. She looked up when Sylvia came in. "You're Miss Crane," she said. "I am. Dad talks about you a lot." "Does he?" "Mm-hmm." She went back to drawing. "He says you're really smart. I appreciate that. He says that like it's a compliment, but he also says it like it explains why things are complicated. Like smart people make things more complicated than they have to be sometimes." Sylvia paused in the doorway. She looked across the office at Daniel, who was standing by the coffee station with his back to them, in the way of someone who could very much hear what was happening, but had decided his contribution at this point would be to pretend he couldn't. "Your father is perceptive," Sylvia said. "That means he sees things clearly," Nora said. "Yes, he is. He noticed I was sad 3 months ago before I even knew I was sad, and he made us go to the park and he got the hot dogs, and then he sat on the bench and didn't say anything about the sad part. Just let me be sad until I was done." She colored in something on the paper. "That's a good dad move. The sad kids at school have dads who ask a lot of questions." "That's not always helpful," Sylvia agreed. "Never helpful," Nora said definitively. "If someone's sad, you just have to be there until they're not sad anymore. The questions are for after." She said this with the authority of someone who has arrived at a working theory through experience and is simply reporting the conclusion. Sylvia looked at her for a moment, at the small, serious face, the precise way she held the pencil, the certainty. "Your dad taught you that?" Sylvia said. "He taught me by doing it," Nora said. "There's a difference." Then she went back to drawing, apparently finished with the observation, and Sylvia pushed herself to her desk and opened her laptop and found that she was having a strange and specific difficulty maintaining her focus on the document in front of her. An hour later, when Daniel and Renata had retreated to the small meeting room with the draft board presentation and a very large amount of printed documentation, Nora migrated from the conference table to the area near Sylvia's office, carrying her box of pencils and establishing herself on the floor outside the door with the particular self-sufficiency of a child who has spent time in adult workplaces and learned to be companionable without being demanding. She drew. Sylvia worked. After about 20 minutes, Nora appeared in the doorway. "Can I come in?" she said. Yes, she came in and stood looking around the office with the frank inventory of a child who doesn't know yet that you're not supposed to look at everything. Her eyes moved across the wall of windows, the desk, the small framed photograph of the original Veritas build team, the stack of contract folders, the whiteboard with its lists and arrows, and then the leather portfolio. It was on the edge of the desk, where it always was. Nora looked at it with the specific attention of someone who has noticed that a thing occupies a consistent and prominent position without ever being used. "What's in that bag?" she said. "Papers," Sylvia said. "What kind of papers?" "Old ones." Nora considered this. "Good old or bad old?" Sylvia looked at the portfolio. "I'm not sure," she said. Nora came closer, around the corner of the desk, and stood very close to the portfolio without touching it, the way children stand close to animals they're curious about, but uncertain of. "It's old," she said. "The leather part is all worn out. I've had it a long time." "How long?" "Since I was about your dad's age." Nora looked up at her. "Why does it stay on the desk if you don't open it?" There was a pause. Sylvia looked at the portfolio, at the tarnished clasp, at the worn leather that she had put her hands on hundreds of times over the past 2 years without opening it. "I'm not sure," she said. It was the most honest answer she had, and she recognized it as honest even as she said it. "Can I see what's inside?" Nora said. "Nora," Daniel's voice from the doorway. He had appeared without sound, which was exactly what Sylvia might have expected, and was looking at his daughter with an expression that was partly parental and partly something more careful. "That's Miss Crane's private, it's all right," Sylvia said. She said it before she had decided to say it. She heard herself say it, and then she sat with what she'd said for a moment. And then she reached out and put her hand on the brass clasp. The clasp was cold, slightly stiff from disuse. She worked it open with the small particular resistance of a thing that hasn't been operated in a long time and has settled into its own stillness. She opened the portfolio. The inside smelled of paper and old ink and a faint sweetness that she couldn't identify exactly. Leather conditioner, maybe? Or just time. It was organized the way she had always organized it, because the inside of the portfolio did not know that anything had changed. There were the preliminary market research notes, handwritten, filed in the front pocket. There were the financial projections from the first year, printed on a home printer on paper that had yellowed very slightly at the edges. And at the back, folded once along the center crease, were the diagrams. She took them out, unfolded them. They were drawn in fine black pen, with measurements annotated in her precise handwriting on large sheets of drafting paper. Building plans, public spaces, a library, a community center, a transit hub, each one showing a standard layout on the left side of the page and an accessibility integrated layout on the right side, with handwritten notes comparing the two, the way of moving through space that most people never had to think about and that some people thought about every single day. They were not professional renderings. They were idea drawings. The kind you make when you can still see the theory as an image before it's been translated into anything formal or defensible. Nora put both elbows on the desk and leaned over them. "These are really good drawings," she said. "Thank you." "Did you make them?" "Yes, when?" "About 6 years ago, before I started the company." Nora pointed at the library diagram. "Is this a place that's easy to get around in? Like if you're in a wheelchair or if you have trouble walking?" "Yes, that's what the drawings are about." "Because your building right now isn't great," Nora said, with the gravity of someone delivering an assessment. "We came in the front entrance and the ramp is really far from where the elevator is. If it was raining, you'd be wet by the time you got there. I noticed because Dad always notices those things, and now I notice them too." Sylvia looked at her. Then she looked at Daniel, who was standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, watching his daughter conduct an accessibility audit of their office building. "You're right," Sylvia said. "The building has some issues. We're working on the landlord about it." "You should show the landlord these drawings," Nora said, "so he can see what it's supposed to look like. That's actually not a bad idea." "I know," Nora said, very simply. Then she pointed at the community center diagram. "These look like the ones Dad makes for his construction jobs. The before and after." She looked up at Sylvia. How come you put them away? There was a pause. Sylvia looked at the drawings. She had looked at them the last time in February of last year, the night before the accident, when she'd packed this portfolio for a meeting the next morning. She had been going to use them at a conference, a visual anchor for a talk she was giving about why remediation never worked as well as integration. She had packed them in this case and set the case by the door and gone to have dinner with Graham. And the drawings had never been used for anything, and afterward she had not been able to look at them because they were from a version of her life that had stopped being available. I thought I couldn't use them anymore, she said. Because of the accident? Yes. Nora looked at the drawings, then at Sylvia. But they're still the same drawings, she said. The accident didn't change them. They're just sitting there. She said this without any particular weight or meaning, as a child says things that are simply true. Because they see the truth, and it doesn't occur to them that the truth might need to be protected from. Sylvia felt something in her chest that she would not have known how to name if she'd tried. You're right, she said. They're still the same drawings. You should start using them again, Nora said. Then she straightened up and looked at the box of pencils she'd brought with her. Can I draw in here for a while? It's quieter than the conference room. Yes, Sylvia said. You can draw in here. Nora settled herself on the floor in the corner by the window with her paper and pencils and began drawing something that might have been a horse, or might have been a building, and Sylvia looked at the portfolio. At the drawing spread across her desk. At the library on the left, inaccessible and familiar. At the library on the right, the way she had imagined it could be. She did not put them away. She picked up a pen and began making notes in the margins. She asked Nora at some point in that morning what she was drawing. I'm drawing the building, Nora said. The way it should look. Which building? This one. She held up the paper. It was a recognizable rendering of the Veritas Build office entrance in blue and green pencil, with the ramp repositioned much closer to the elevator bank. She had also added, on the street side, a covered section, a small roof over the path between the two, so that rain wouldn't be a factor. Sylvia looked at it. The covering is a good idea, she said. Dad says that when you're solving a problem, you should solve all of it, not just the part that's easiest to notice. That sounds like something worth writing down. He says a lot of things like that. I remember them. Nora considered the drawing. He's like that because Grandma was like that. She was a doctor, and she used to say, your job is to look at what's in front of you, not what you expected to see. Your grandma sounds wise. She was. She died when I was little, before Mom. Nora said this with the calm of a child who has accommodated grief by incorporating it rather than by protecting herself from it. Dad says she would have really liked Mom, and he says she would have liked you too. Sylvia was very still for a moment. He says that? She said, He says you're the kind of person Grandma would call a real one. Nora colored in the roof on her drawing. I think that means you're not fake. That's a good interpretation. Dad's not fake about anything, Nora said. Sometimes I wish he was because it would be easier. Like sometimes you just want someone to say it's fine when it's not fine. But he never does that. She looked up. Do you think that's good or bad? Sylvia thought about this seriously. Good, she said. Mostly good. That's what I think too, Nora said. Mostly, she went back to drawing. The covered path over the entrance. The ramp positioned correctly. A small figure in a wheelchair, rendered carefully and without drama, moving through the space the way a person moves through a space that was built for them. Sylvia watched her draw. She thought about the first time she had noticed Daniel looking at her. Not at the wheelchair, not past it, just at her, and had felt the particular disorientation of being seen in a way that doesn't calculate what it's seen. She thought about all the things she had carefully not named over the past weeks, the way she watched for him in the mornings, the way her attention shifted when he was in the building, the way the 45-minute text to Nora's sitter hadn't been accidental. She looked at the portfolio, open on her desk, the drawings spread out. She thought, a person who doesn't look at the wheelchair can still see the person in it. She thought, that is not a small thing. She thought, it is probably the thing. She did not say any of this to Nora, because Nora was 7 and was busy solving the architectural problem of the front entrance, which was its own kind of love. But she sat with it. The 3 Luau meetings that Daniel had set up happened over the following 2 days. He ran them differently than she expected, not as a pitch exactly, more as a direct conversation about what these developers were already planning and where the cost of getting it wrong would show up, and whether the cost of getting it right from the start would be less than the cost of fixing it after. He was good at this, she realized, watching him in the second meeting from her position across the table. Not good at sales. Good at the kind of honesty that sounds like sales until you realize you're just being told the truth in a way that makes you think clearly. All 3 resulted in letters of intent. She did not let herself feel too much about this either. But in the car on the way back from the 3rd meeting, she found herself saying, without planning to, "Thank you. For the Barrows call. For all of this." He looked at the road. "You would have gotten there yourself. Maybe slower, maybe," he agreed. "Does it matter to you? Getting credit for it?" He glanced at her, briefly, the way you glance at someone when you want to check if they're asking what you think they're asking. "No," he said. "It doesn't matter to me at all." She nodded and looked at the road. She thought about the 7-year-old sitting on her office floor drawing horses or buildings, and the father who had built a person like that out of 3 years of grief, and a decision to just keep showing up, and the way the drawings had still been there in the portfolio unchanged, waiting. She thought. Direction. She thought, moving with something rather than through it or past it. She didn't say any of this. But the direction felt different than it had in February. Different than it had even 6 months ago. She was still in the wheelchair. The board review was tomorrow, and it would be hard, and it might not go the way it needed to go. The mountain of it was still there. She was just looking at it differently. She was looking at the drawings again. That night, she spread them out on the kitchen table in her apartment. She looked at them for a long time. Then she took photos of each one with her phone and sent them to Priya Nair with a note that said, "Can we schedule time to talk about these this week?" Priya replied at 11:15 that night, "Yes. These are beautiful. Did you make these?" "Yes," Sylvia wrote back. Priya's reply was, "They should be in the pitch deck." Sylvia sat with that for a moment. Then she wrote, "I was thinking the same thing." She folded the drawings back into the portfolio. She closed the clasp. The same small resistance, the same cold brass. But it was different now. Less like sealing something off, more like putting something away that you intend to take back out. She had learned the difference. Finally, the portfolio went on the kitchen table, visible, and she went to bed, and she slept better than she had in a very long time. The board review was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon in the Veritas Build conference room, the room with the mountain view, which she had chosen deliberately. The window that showed you something worth working toward. The mountains didn't care either way, but she cared about them being there. Conrad arrived early. He brought 4 of the coalition investors, not all 11, just the 4 he considered most decisive. Renata Forbes came with her audit binders, organized by section in the way of someone who has done this many times and knows that clarity is its own argument. Rachel was there in her capacity as legal counsel. Daniel arrived at 3:55 and sat in the chair beside Sylvia's at the head of the table, which was, strictly speaking, not his chair, but no one said anything about it. Sylvia thought, this is what it looks like when someone is in the room. The coalition's case was presented first. Conrad had organized it well, he was always methodical, and the investor he had designated to present it, a man named Harold Fisk, who ran a mid-sized private equity firm and had been on the Veritas Build investor list since the 2nd year, walked through the concerns in order. The contract losses, the reduced headcount, the quarterly revenue decline, the pause in investor confidence, and finally, in a tone of deliberate neutrality, the question of whether the company's leadership was adequately positioned to address these challenges given the circumstances of the last 22 months. He did not use the word from the article. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room had read the article. Sylvia let him finish. She did not interrupt. Conrad, across the table, watched her while Fisk spoke. His expression was the careful expression of someone who has decided they are doing the right thing and has found, somewhere along the way, that doing the right thing was not as clean as they'd expected. There was something in his face that she had not seen in months. Not triumph, not satisfaction, more like grief, wearing the suit of strategy. She thought, he does love this company. She thought, that's the part that makes this complicated. When Fisk was done, Renata Forbes opened the first binder. She presented the independent audit in the direct, data-first way of someone who respects her audience enough not to perform conviction. The operational record for the prior 18 months, contracts initiated, contracts completed, client retention rates, revenue by quarter, expense management, headcount decisions, and the rationale behind each one. The numbers were not spectacular. They were honest. They showed a company that had gone through a serious interruption and had managed it with a restraint that a lot of companies had not managed in similar circumstances. No panic hiring, no panic cutting, no pivots in the middle of the crisis that would have cost more than the crisis itself. Fisk looked at the binder. He did not look particularly surprised. He looked like a man revising an estimate downward from a position he'd already started to soften. Then Rachel walked through the legal standing of the board review, the proper channels, the procedural requirements, the timeline under which an emergency review could be legitimately called, and the ways in which this one did not meet those requirements. She was not aggressive about it. She was just precise, which was its own kind of argument. Then Sylvia spoke. She had prepared for this. She had been preparing for it for 15 days, with Renata and Rachel in the evenings, with Daniel at the conference table after the office cleared out. She had thought about what to say, how to say it, how much to give them, and how much to hold back. She had prepared a version of this speech that was formal and measured, and left the emotional temperature of the room exactly where it was. She had decided, at some point in the last 3 days, not to give that version. She set the leather portfolio on the table. The room noticed it. Fiska looked at it, briefly. Conrad looked at it, and his expression shifted in a way she could not entirely interpret. She opened the clasp. She took out the drawings. She unfolded them and set them on the table, facing the coalition side, so that Fisk and Conrad and the other 3 investors could see them. The library on the left, the library on the right. The community center, before and after. The transit hub, 6 years of a theory about the built environment, drawn by hand before there was anything to show for it. I made these in the year before I founded Veritas Build, she said. Not as portfolio pieces, not for any pitch. They were just the way I thought about the problem. The way I tried to make visible, for myself, what I was trying to do. She looked at the drawings, then at the table. The accident did not change what is in these drawings. The accident changed a significant number of things about my life, and I have spent 22 months working with those changes, and I am not going to stand here and tell you that it was simple, or that there weren't months where the company struggled because I was struggling. She looked at Fisk. I'm also not going to stand here and pretend that the article that appeared in the Denver Business Journal last month was anything other than what it was. A deliberate mischaracterization of my capacity, sourced from inside this organization, timed to coincide with the board review, and designed to create the appearance of a leadership crisis where the reality is a company that has navigated a serious period and is now, by the numbers in front of you, turning in a demonstrably different direction. Conrad looked at the table. Sylvia looked at him. I know why you did it, she said. Not with anger. With something more precise than anger. You are protecting the people who work here. You are protecting the investors who trusted you with their confidence. You believe that the path forward for this company doesn't run through me. I have disagreed with you about that for 22 months, and I am going to keep disagreeing with you about it, and I think the documentation in front of you shows who is right. She paused. I also think, she said more quietly, that you built this company's financial infrastructure from nothing, and that you care about its survival in a way that is real, even if I think you are wrong about what survival requires. I'm not going to pretend otherwise just because we're on opposite sides of this table. Conrad looked up. His face had done something complicated and unresolved. Daniel spoke for the first time. He'd been sitting quietly for the entire presentation. Legal pad on the table in front of him, a pen he hadn't uncapped. Now he set the pen down and looked at the coalition investors with the direct, considered manner of a man who has chosen his moment and knows exactly what he wants to say. I signed a minority equity investment in Veritas Build 2 months ago, he said. I've been in this office almost every week since. I've watched the operations. I've talked to the team. I've been in the client meetings and the contract conversations and the evenings when the work ran late. He looked at Fisk. And what I can tell you, as someone who has spent 9 years in commercial construction identifying what a company's actual foundation looks like versus what it looks like from the outside, this company's foundation is sound. The article was wrong. The emergency designation of this review is wrong. And these 3 letters of intent, he reached into the folder in front of him and set 3 envelopes on the table. From developers who were interested in Veritas Build as a design phase partner, signed in the last 2 weeks, suggests that the market's opinion of this company's future is not what this review is implying. He slid the envelopes to the center of the table. He said nothing else. Fisk picked up one of the envelopes, looked at the letterhead, looked at Daniel. You are a construction project manager, he said, not an investor of record. What is your interest in this? I'm an equity holder, Daniel said, which makes me a stakeholder. And I have a direct professional interest in the question of whether the built environment in this city gets designed for the people who live in it or continues to be designed for the people who have never needed to think about it. He was very level about this. That's my interest. Fiske looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the letters of intent. Then he looked at the drawings on the table. There was a quality of silence in the conference room that was different from the silence at the beginning. At the beginning, the silence had been the silence of people preparing to argue. Now it was the silence of people doing arithmetic that they had not expected to have to do. Conrad spoke. He spoke quietly and without looking at anyone specifically, looking instead at the center of the table, at the drawings spread out there. The hotel chain engagement, he said. The phased audit. 6 properties, Wyoming and Colorado. I've looked at those numbers. If the partnership model holds through the full scope, that's a revenue trajectory that changes the quarterly story significantly. He paused. I didn't realize the partnership model had moved this far this fast. It moved because we moved it, Sylvia said. I know. He was quiet for another moment. Harold, he looked at Fisk. I want to table the emergency review. Fiske looked at him. I want to table it, Conrad said again. I think we look at the Q4 numbers, the Barros, deliverables, and these letters of intent, and we schedule a standard quarterly review instead of an emergency one, and we go from there. The silence again. Fiske looked at Sylvia, at Daniel, at the drawings, at Rachel, who showed him nothing on her face, which was its own communication. Agreed, Fiske said. The review ended 40 minutes later. The investors left. Rachel left, with her briefcase and her characteristic expression of having done exactly what she'd come to do. Renata Forbes collected her binders. Conrad was the last to leave. He stopped in the doorway of the conference room and looked at Sylvia, and for a moment he looked like the man who had walked into her office 5 years ago and said, I want to build something that matters. The partnership model, he said. You were right about it. She looked at him. I know, she said. He nodded once. Left, the conference room was quiet. The mountain view held its position through the window, indifferent and present. Daniel was still at the table. He'd gone still in the way he did when he was finished with the thing and was letting the finished quality of it settle. He looked at the leather portfolio, open on the table, the drawings still spread out. He looked at Sylvia. You're still here, she said. He looked at her. Where else would I be? She had been meaning to reorganize the drawings, fold them back into the portfolio, but instead she sat with them there on the table between them and the mountains in the window behind them and the particular quality of late afternoon light that came through the glass at this hour, gold and honest. She said, I think I might be able to stand. She had not planned to say this. She had been carrying it for weeks, this information from Dr. Wen, this thing that was measurable and real, but that she had been unable to find the right moment to put into language for another person. She had been waiting, she realized, for this moment, for this room, for this particular quality, a finished. Daniel looked at her. The physical therapy, she said. There's been a change. In the left leg. Dr. Wen says the response is significant enough to begin the next phase. When did you find out? 6 weeks ago. He was quiet for a moment. You've been carrying that by yourself for 6 weeks. Yes, he looked at the table. Then back at her. Okay, he said. Just okay. Not what she'd feared, the rush of reaction, the performing of hope on her behalf, the weight of his expectation that she would now get better in the ways he was imagining. Just, okay. I hear you. I want to try, she said. Right now. I've been doing the exercises. Doctor, Wen says the muscle response is there. I've been doing it in the sessions and I want to try here. He stood up immediately. Not rushing, just ready. He came around the table and positioned himself in front of her, stable and solid, and held out both hands. She put her hands in his. She felt the particular quality of his grip, not tight, not tentative. Steady, the kind of steady that doesn't announce itself. She breathed. She found the engagement Dr. Wen had been building with her for 6 weeks, the specific internal shift that she had been practicing in the quiet of early mornings in a clinical room. The communication between brain and body that had been interrupted and was slowly rerouting, she pushed. It took 31 seconds. She knew because she had been counting, not deliberately, just the way you count when you're doing something that matters, and time becomes both very long and very short at once. 31 seconds of effort that she could feel from somewhere deep in her left leg, the sensation arriving at her foot, the weight shifting, her hands tightening on his. She stood. Not fully, not with ease, not the way a person stands who has never had to think about standing. She stood with her weight on both arms and the chair behind her and Daniel in front of her, and she was not certain she could have held it without all three. But she was standing. She was standing in the conference room with the mountain view on a Tuesday afternoon in November, and the drawings were spread out on the table behind her, and the board review was tabled, and Conrad had said she was right, and there were 3 letters of intent in the center of the table. And she was standing. She held it for 11 seconds. Then she sat back down, carefully, and Daniel's hands did not let go until she was fully seated. And then they stayed for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, his hands and hers, in that particular arrangement of human contact that doesn't have a specific name, but that everyone who has experienced it recognizes. 11 seconds, he said. I was counting, she said. So was I. She looked at the mountains. She looked at the drawings. She looked at Daniel Reese, who was kneeling in front of her wheelchair with his hands still loosely around hers, and an expression on his face that she had not yet seen there before. Not the patient stillness, something more alive than that. Something that she had been recognizing for a while now without quite letting herself name it. She named it. She did not say it out loud. But she named it. The drawings, she said. Priya wants to put them in the pitch deck. Good, he said. They're going to need to be redrawn properly. Professionally, Priya can do that. Or she'll know who can. The library won first. I think the library is the strongest argument. Tell me why. So she told him, sitting in the conference room in the gold afternoon light with the mountains behind them and the drawings on the table and their hands still joined, the specific thing about the library that she had drawn 6 years ago. The thing she had understood before she could prove it, that the way a space is designed is a statement about who belongs in it, and that spaces designed only for one kind of body are spaces that say, to every other kind, that you are the exception, the accommodation, the afterthought. And that the work of Veritas Build was to make that statement different. To say from the first blueprint that every person who will ever use this space belongs in it from the start. He listened to all of it. He didn't look away. When she was finished, he said, Can I ask you something? Yes, the night you told me about the accident. About Graham. You said the hardest part wasn't the physical. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, do you still believe that? Right now? She thought about it. No, she said slowly. Right now, the hardest part and the physical part have kind of become the same thing, in a way I didn't expect. He nodded once. That sounds like progress, he said. It is, she said. I think. Good. He let go of her hands. Stood up. looked at the table and began, carefully and precisely, collecting the drawings, straightening them, aligning the edges, not putting them back in the portfolio, just organizing them, keeping them out. She watched him do this. She thought about the first time she'd seen him, waiting in her lobby with a 7-year-old and a 3-page handwritten business case, and the way she'd looked at him across the conference table and thought, he's watching me, not the wheelchair. She thought about the way he'd come back, again and again, not announcing his intention to stay, not asking her to believe he would, just staying. The hotel chain audit, she said, the 6-property engagement. When we move into the second phase, I want to use the original drawings as design benchmarks. The before and after format, but scaled up. Real buildings, real comparisons. He looked at her, then at the drawings in his hands. That's good, he said. That's very good. I know, she said. And something in the way she said it, the small confidence of it, the ownership, made him smile. It was not a dramatic smile. It was the quiet, private smile of a person who has been watching someone come back to themselves and finds when it happens that it is as complete and ordinary as a door opening that has been closed a long time. She picked up the leather portfolio, held it. I'm going to start carrying these open, she said. The drawings. In the portfolio? No. In a tube. The way architects carry them, so they can be unrolled without refolding. He looked at her. You sure? I'm sure, she said. She set the portfolio down on the table. She did not put the drawings back in it. She would get a tube. She would carry the drawings the way they were meant to be carried. The portfolio would still come with her, it was still hers, but it would carry different things now. The things from before could graduate to somewhere they could be seen. The drawings stayed on the table. The mountains stayed in the window. Daniel picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Nora wants to know, he said, in the tone of someone raising a subject that has been raised before and not resolved, whether she can come to the office again sometime. Sylvia looked at the table. At the corner by the window where Nora had sat on the floor with her colored pencils. At the drawing that Nora had left behind, which Sylvia had taped to the edge of her monitor that afternoon. A 7-year-old's rendering of what was either a horse or a building, in blue and green and very careful lines. Tell her yes, Sylvia said. She can come whenever she wants. He nodded. He put on his jacket. He moved toward the door. Daniel, she said. He stopped. She looked at him, at the way he stood in the doorway, patient and unhurried, not forcing a moment that wasn't there yet, but not retreating from the one that was. Stay, she said, for a little while longer. I want to talk through the Q1 plan. He came back. He sat down. They worked until the light through the window had turned from gold to gray, and the mountains were just a darker shape against a darkening sky. And Nora texted from the sitter's place asking when her dad was coming home, and Daniel texted back 45 minutes, which was generous, and Sylvia pretended not to see the text and went on talking, and neither of them said anything about the extra 45 minutes. But neither of them left. Here is what the story was, when it was finished being what it looked like. It was not a rescue. That is the first thing and the most important one, and if you take nothing else from it, take that. Not a rescue. Not a man who arrived to fix a woman who was broken. Not a woman who required a man in order to become herself again. It was a refusal. He refused to see her as a tragedy. He refused to calculate the odds and decide they weren't good enough. He refused to walk out when the door was right there, and the walking out would have been entirely defensible, and no one would have blamed him. Every person has a point at which the sensible thing and the right thing diverge, and how you navigate that divergence is the whole of what you are. Daniel Reese, from the moment he sat down across from her with 3 pages of handwritten notes and waited to be told he wasn't the right fit, had made the same decision every single time the divergence appeared. He refused to leave. Sylvia refused too. She refused to let the accident be the last page. She refused to let Conrad Weld or the Investor Coalition or a 3-word headline decide who this company was or who she was. She had been refusing for 22 months before Daniel walked through that door, carrying his daughter in his careful honesty and his grandmother's inheritance, and the will to bet it on something the rest of the room had stopped believing in. She had been refusing alone. She kept refusing after that with company. The refusal was always hers. The company was new. And Nora, who looked at a worn leather portfolio sitting on a desk and asked, without any agenda except genuine curiosity, "How come you never opened that?" A 7-year-old who had absorbed her father's quality of going directly toward the thing rather than circling it. Because she had grown up in a house where circling things was too expensive, where it was better to say the word and deal with it, where the questions were hard, but the silence was harder. She had walked into that office with her colored pencils and her observations about the front entrance ramp and her frank assessment of the drawings. They're still the same drawings. And she had broken the last wall by simply not knowing it was a wall. The drawings went to a proper tube. The original portfolio sits on a shelf in Sylvia's office now, still present, still worn, still carrying the weight of everything it carried. But it's not a sealed thing anymore. It was never supposed to be a sealed thing. The company made it. Not easily, not without setbacks that come after this one, not without the ongoing difficulty of doing work that the market doesn't always know it needs yet. But it made it. The Barras project became a case study that 3 other Denver developers called about in the first quarter alone. The hotel chain engagement expanded to 11 properties. The drawings from the portfolio, redrawn professionally by Priya Nair's team, scaled up, cleaned up, but still recognizable as the hand-drawn originals, became the centerpiece of the new pitch deck. And the standing. That was not the story's end, because the story did not end in a single moment of standing in a conference room. Recovery does not work that way. It is a long, non-linear, frequently frustrating accumulation of small returned functions, and there were weeks after that Tuesday where the progress was invisible, and weeks where it went backward, and weeks where Sylvia sat in the physical therapy room with Dr. Went and thought about what she had told herself when she was in the rehabilitation center 22 months ago, that she did not know what the other side of this looked like, only that she was going to find out. She was still finding out. Daniel was still finding out. About Clara. About what 3 years of surviving looked like from the other side. About what it meant to let Nora see him build a future rather than just maintain a present. They were all still finding out. All 3 of them. Which is the only kind of finding out that's actually real. Here is what Sylvia learned about the people who don't leave. They don't announce it. They don't stand in the doorway and declare their intentions. They just keep not leaving, day after day, in the ordinary, unremarkable way that things that last actually last. And if you pay attention, not to the dramatic moments, not to the confrontations and the board reviews and the days when everything is on the table, but to the quiet ones, the unremarkable ones. The Tuesday afternoons when someone stays 45 minutes longer than they said they would, and neither of you mentions it, you'll find that this is where the thing actually happens. Not in the standing, in the staying.